Hey,
Hey, how are you?
good, and you?
Good, thank you.
Nice. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, and you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, we'll give it a little time for people to join, but
Mm-hmm.
it looks like we already have quite a few people joining. There's already close to 200.
Nice.
Yeah. So, do you have the subjects in front of you that people suggested for the chat?
I can get them in front of me. Let's do
No,
that.
that's okay. It's not critical, but
Okay.
I'm happy to ask you. Just
It's gonna
curious.
be easier.
Yeah. Do you remember if there were any of them that specifically appealed to you?
They were all interesting, not all easy to answer in a very quick way, but
Yeah, yeah.
I recall those about agitation, for example. How useful is it when extracting coffee?
hmm
Let me bring it up. So do you want to attack them one by one and then do
Yeah, I
questions?
mean, I think we'll get through some of them. I think people will post comments and questions, and I think we'll just let the conversation go where it goes. And I'm not worried about how many we cover.
Okay,
Um,
great.
okay, so I'll just give it another minute, and then maybe introduce what we're doing and who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's 1 o'clock, so let's do it. So hi everybody, I'm Scott, and this here is my friend Jonathan Gagne, who is astrophysicist and also a coffee fanatic. And I'm really excited to announce that Jonathan has written a book called The Physics of Filter Coffee. And I'm going to help him publish it, and we're going to sell it on my website. And it is amazing. I've read the book many times to proofread a little bit, and it is so dense with scientific information and facts rather than speculations, like more so than any book about coffee ever. So I'm really excited for that. Jonathan, tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the book.
Yeah, sure. So my main work, as Scott said, is to do research in astrophysics. So currently I work as a researcher at the Montreal Planetarium. I specialize on young stars, brown dwarfs, and exoplanets. And since I would say I started to go really deep in coffee since 2018, it's been a little bit above
hmm
2 years, I would say.
Yep.
I've been a fan of doing pour over for much longer, but it's really been 2 years since I've really dug into the science of it.
hmm
And I started a blog about 2 years ago to write down what I found. And gradually, I ended up like really understanding more about percolation, about pour overs, about how extraction happens. And I decided to put that all together, like my mental picture of what happens when we brew coffee and all of the understanding I had gathered. I decided to put that into a book.
hmm
Only after I had like so much material on the blog that I could actually make something that's coherent.
Yeah, yeah. What I love about what you do is that you actually put painstaking effort into collecting a lot of data. And we all have ideas about coffee. I feel like much of what I've learned is through experience and experimentation, but the type of experimentation you do is a lot more refined and professional than what the rest of us in coffee do. And it makes everything you do, like, it makes me more confident in what you come up with. Like when you come up and you say, "Hey, I've got this idea," like I'm already sold on it because I know you've put in the homework. You
Nice,
know.
thanks.
And I should say, Jonathan's blog is called Coffee Ad Astra,
Hmm.
and that's really worth reading. It's one of the like only 3 or 4 coffee blogs that I personally read. It's really fantastic. So,
Nice.
um, okay, cool. So, a bunch of readers have suggested topics for this Instagram live chat about coffee brewing. So we're going to cover some of those topics, and people are welcome to post questions and comments. And Jonathan, I don't know if you know this, but if you put your finger on the comment thread, and
Right, yeah.
if you scroll down, you can look at the previous comments that people
Yeah.
posted it because they're going to fly by. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of what people wrote, and so anyway, that's an option. So one of the first comments people posted was, and I think this is kind of an easy one for us to cover, is how does agitation affect extraction?
Yeah. You want me to
Um,
try it?
yeah, sure, go for it.
Okay. So when extraction happens, basically you have coffee solubles, so chemical compounds that come out of the coffee particles and into the water. And as that happens, the water around the particles gets more concentrated. And the more concentrated that water gets, the slower the process of extraction is. So basically, it's the cleaner the water is, the more potent it is at extraction. And as you extract, if you don't agitate, let's say an immersion, if you don't agitate it, it's going to get really concentrated around the particles and it's going to slow down the extraction very fast.
Yeah.
But if you agitate it, you're going to redistribute all of the concentration further away from the particles and you're going to help extraction.
Sure.
I think this also happens in percolation, but like agitation has another advantage in percolation in that it helps you to get a more even flow everywhere in the coffee bed. So it helps you destroy any channel that would have formed where water is all flowing there. So if you can agitate everything and if the coffee bed falls back flatly, then you can help get a more even flow through the bed. You really
Now,
want to avoid pockets that don't touch water, basically.
now, but if I'm correct, spinning or swirling the brewer is far more effective form of agitation for decreasing channels than stirring would be. Like I used to stir for a long time, and I think stirred judiciously you can help channels, you can help prevent some of them. But I think the swirling seems to do a much better job of eliminating channels without causing potential new channels to form. Like if you
Right.
overstir, you can create new channels essentially by creating like a moat around the edges in a sense if you stir
Yes.
too hard. Yeah,
Yeah. You can dig holes basically, which makes
exactly.
channels. So
Yeah.
you have like several ways of agitating. You have like stirring, you have swirling,
Hmm.
and even if you just pour water from your kettle, the stream that falls onto the slurry is going to agitate everything. So unless you make it fall very slowly into small droplets, then you
Yep.
would have almost no agitation.
So I want to say something, and this will transition into the next question. The next question has to do with when is less agitation better, and is mellow drip a gimmick? Um, so of course, we both really like swirling, but you can over swirl. If you swirl too much or too hard, theoretically, you end up with more fine particles clogging the pores of the paper filter in a manual brew, right? So we've all had the experience where if you swirl too much, your brew gets slower, and then you end up with a new kind of channeling because clogging certain areas of the filter and slowing down the flow too much will probably make the water want to channel around clogs, if you will.
Yeah.
But you've got a lot more experience with the mellow drip than I do. So what's your experience with mellow drip like? Does it have a use? Is it mostly just something that's just going to be popular with some people, or do you find it really useful in any way?
I find it really useful for experimentation. In my case, I've used it with many experiments when I really want to remove agitation. It really does what it says it does,
Hmm.
which is it removes all agitation. So basically, if you don't know what the millidrip is, it's a small device that you pour water into and it splits the stream of your kettle into many, many streams. But each of these streams are so slow that they're basically just droplets of water, and this removes any agitation of the bed. So if you have a really bad grinder that's going to produce a lot of fines, it's possible that this might really help you because it might stop migration of fines to the bottom. It's going to limit it. But in my case, I haven't found a recipe that I preferred with the Miller drip. However, I wouldn't say with confidence that this is never that this is always going to be true. I think as we explore different methods and as we understand better how percolation works, I expect to take out my Miller drip a couple more times and try new things with it. So I'm not close-minded to the fact that I could at some point prefer a recipe that uses it, but so far, what it's done for me is really reducing the extraction yield. So I ended up with much, much weaker brews. But I work with a grinder that produces an unusual small amount of fines. So I really don't get that benefit of limiting clogging from the low agitation. So
Yeah.
I tend to prefer to go with really high agitation to get a
Hmm.
more even extraction.
Yeah. As do I. I mean, would you agree that it seems like most of the people who make use of the mellow drip don't use it exclusively during a brew? They just use it during certain phases of the brew. Otherwise, the extraction drops like 4 or 5%, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's been my experience too. It drops a lot even if I use it, even if I do a bloom normally, and then I use Miller Drip for all of the rest of the brew. I still have a 2-3% drop at least in extraction
Yeah.
yield compared to my other recipe. I used to see people that use the Miller drip for the whole brew, but nowadays I see more of a variation swapping between one and the other.
Yeah. So Dennis, a couple minutes ago, wrote a question about, and this is something I'm really not sure about. I've tried it, and I think you have too, but it says, what about rotating the brewer to separate the fines on the outside and they remain on top of the filter? So in other words, what about swirling so hard in the beginning that a lot of fines get lifted and sit on the upper part of the filter, and then they're no longer in the way during the rest of the brew? Like, do you think that that happens, or do you think it's useful?
I think it's a good idea and it might help. I've played a little bit with it, but as I said, I don't have a lot of fines anyway. But I do see that happening when I swirl very hard during the bloom. I do see fines getting captured upward on the filter, assuming you're using a conical filter like
Mm-hmm.
V60. And I suspect it could be useful if you have a lot of fines in your grinder, but then you would have to avoid like pouring on the edges of the filter to bring back the fines inside of the brew. But that would be one strategy I would try when brewing with a coffee that produces a lot of fines. So like swirl a lot during bloom, but not necessarily during the next phases. Like I
Yeah.
would do normal swirls after that.
Yeah, I agree. I found better success with that as well. Um, this could be complicated, but how do you feel about going through the steps all the way from the beginning, almost knowing nothing, until like a sort of an expert level of how to dial in a coffee for filter?
Yeah, that's a hard question actually. So one thing in my experience that I would really recommend is to start too coarse, not too
Yeah,
fine.
yeah,
If you start too fine, which I did when I first received my grinder, I wasn't sure what was too coarse or too fine back then, and I started way too fine. And it was really confusing, like how it sometimes got better as I went finer,
hmm,
but it all tasted bad, but it kind of got better as I went finer. And it also got better as I went coarser, so it was
yeah,
really
yeah,
confusing.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you have these like valleys and hills is when you're too fine, but you're never gonna like find the real optimum if you keep going finer and finer and finer. So I would say start way too coarse, make sure it's too coarse and that your brew is a bit weak,
hmm,
and then gradually go finer. Another approach I like is to brew 3 or 4 coffees all in a row with very different grind sizes, and then note on the under a glass, for example, what setting I used, and blindly taste them and rate them.
hmm,
And then after that, look at the grind sizes. This is going to help you figure out a rough idea of where your optimum is.
yeah,
I did that twice with my grinder on the first day. I did that with big gaps between each brew, and then I chose my favorite one and I tried small changes around that number,
hmm.
and that's how I found really the one I was sure about.
So I would have to say I agree with starting too coarse and trying progressively finer settings. And it's important to note that once you get to the point where you're getting consistent astringency, meaning dryness in the palate, you know you've gone too fine. That is to say with a little asterisk that as long as your procedure, your stirring, your pouring is really consistent, because you could always have one astringent brew just due to bad form, pouring too much in one spot, or swirling too much and creating clogging or whatever. It's not always about the grind setting, of course, but to me, I've always, like, way before refractometers existed, when I dialed in batch brew or manual brew, I would always go a little finer, a little finer, a little finer. I'd find some astringency and I'd back off 1 or 2 settings to the point where I felt like I could comfortably avoid astringency. And that was usually about the best spot to be for a given recipe.
Yeah. Yeah, I would add one other thing also. If you're going to dial in one coffee per day,
Hmm.
like just brew one coffee in the morning and then the next morning try a different one, I would advise to be slow to draw conclusions, require more than one brew to determine which is your favorite one. Because if you every morning you brew and one brew is worse, one brew is better, and then you keep moving in grind size, some of what you're observing might just be a different pouring technique or something
Yeah.
happened to your tap water that day, or I don't know. It's
Yeah.
easier to do it either all next to each other on the same day or be very slow, be patient.
Yes.
before you change. Yeah.
I think the big difference between scientists like yourself who do experimentation with coffee and the average barista or coffee lover who does experiments is that I see too many coffee people just find something happens once or twice and forms a conclusion from it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we both know that it's, there are outliers, there's technique problems, and
Mm-hmm.
you have to really be rigorous about not changing the coffee, not changing your method. Like, and if you're changing anything, you're really just changing one thing at a time, and you're getting, dozens and dozens of results before you start thinking, okay, this is the right direction to go in.
Yeah. This is the first thing I kind of attacked when I started my blog, trying to get everything really consistent, my water, my kettle pours, my grinder, everything as repeatable as I could, because that can really prevent you from observing trends.
Yeah,
You're getting too much variation.
yeah. Um, a few people have asked about how many pours to do. I know years ago I used to only do a pre-wet plus one pour.
Hmm.
Um, I did that in part because I think that doing just one pour keeps the slurry temperature a little bit hotter,
Yeah.
and I've always been frustrated by the fact that it's very hard to keep the slurry hot enough in a manual brew like a V60 or a Kalita. Um, and over time, I've shifted to sacrificing a little bit of temperature for a little bit of extraction gain by doing two pours after the pre-wet. Um, Talk to me about the pros and cons of different amounts of pours. Like, how do we know let's say you're doing 20 or 22 grams and you're doing maybe 340, 375 grams of water. Like why are we doing pre-wet plus two now? Like, would a third one be better, or, what are we going to gain and lose by doing that?
Right, so it's mostly about what you just mentioned. So brew temperature is one important factor. If you do many small pours, especially if you wait for the water to be below the level of the coffee bed, the temperature is going to drop a lot. For example, water is really good at conducting temperature. So if the water always remains above the bed of coffee, it's gonna maintain a stable temperature inside of the slurry. It's gonna lose some to the air, but if you place a temperature probe in your slurry, you're gonna see that at any point when the water goes below the coffee bed, the temperature plummets really, really fast.
Yeah.
So you're gonna get like variations in brew temperature as you pour, even if you don't wait for the water to go below the coffee bed. But then if you do more pours, you're separating the extracts that come out from the coffee particles. You're waiting for them to drop from the dripper, and then you're adding clean water, and that makes it much more potent at extracting more.
Yeah.
So if you do many pours, you're going to reach higher extractions at the end. Another way to say this is that you're going to make the concentration inside the coffee particles lower. So you're going to
Mhm.
remove most of the stuff. Um, so you're going to extract more, but potentially with cooler temperatures, and you're going to get different results from that. And you're also going to get much longer brew times if you
Yep.
do many small pours. If you do
Yep.
one big pour, you have all the weight of water above the coffee bed. And the taller this is, the more weight it's going to apply in the water to flow faster. So if you do many, many pours, you can end up having a slower brew. And if you also have clogging, that can become even more of an issue. So usually I used to do two pours, mostly with the V60, even with the plastic V60, which is a pretty good thermal insulator. But now that I use the Stag X, I have a better thermal insulation, and I do quite regularly four pours.
Oh,
And
wow.
I'm getting pretty good results with that.
Are you including the pre-wet as one of those pours, or are you doing a
Nope.
pre-wet plus four? Pre-wet plus four. Wow.
Yeah. It's a bit
Okay.
extreme, but I
Yeah.
found pretty good results with it so
Okay.
far.
And I'd want to add something that you taught me that I was suspicious of, but you definitely confirmed, is that if you were to do, say, one pour after the pre-wet and you had a very high slurry in the V60, you're going to end up with a little bit more bypass water.
Yes. Yes, you're gonna get, so it's a bit like you're applying some more pressure on the whole system. And especially if you ground fine and the coffee bed offers a lot of resistance to the flow of water, the more pressure you're gonna apply, the more water is gonna want to flow everywhere else.
Yeah.
So if you press a lot, then a lot of water is gonna flow around the edges of the coffee bed. And that's one reason why I now prefer flat bottoms. I think you have a little bit less of that effect that of water going around the bed. With the V60, it's particularly an issue because you have a lot of water on the edges above the coffee bed that is actually pushing through the filter. So not all water is going to go around the coffee bed, but some of it is going to. And even if you do center pours, you're not going to prevent that. I often hear people say, do a center pour to prevent bypass, but it won't. The
No,
water
no.
is going
Yeah.
to accumulate on the sides and it's going to flow on the sides anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Let's talk briefly. There's a few questions about how grind quality affects pour over recipe.
Mm-hmm,
I've recently, made some points about, you know, I regret in a way that I posted a video online of me making a pour over that took 5 minutes. Not because I think that it's bad for it to take 5 minutes, but because I realized belatedly that too many people are using grinders that don't do a great job.
mm-hmm.
And with bad technique or with bad grind quality, 5 minutes is going to be very hard to achieve without having some astringency.
Yeah,
And at the extreme, if someone was making, say, a pour over with a whirly grinder, like one of those little,
yeah,
$20 jobs, they would have so many boulders and so many fines and coffee dust that, realistically, they would end up with, I think, a relatively fast brew because they would get astringency at any finer of a grind setting that would,
yeah.
go slower. So, I mean, have you thought much about how grind quality affects how you would approach a pour over?
Yeah, so I think that the better the quality you have, which is another way to say the more uniform the
Yeah.
particles are, the more you can reduce the average size to smaller size and then achieve a similar flow of water through the bed.
Hmm.
And flow is a very important variable in my opinion. It's what seems to really determine when you start to get more channeling and more harsh flavors. So if you start to clog or to get very slow flow, that's when you're starting to get problems. So if your grinder generates many fines or a very wide distribution with a lot of fines and boulders, you're going to be forced to approach it with a coarser average. And so you're going to get a little bit less extraction. But it's like if you were saying we are trying to selectively remove the compounds we like in coffee
Hmm.
and leave the compounds that taste harsh inside of the coffee particles. And it's a little bit like saying that a better grinder is going to allow you to pick out the good components with more precision. And a bad grinder is going to allow you to just do a very coarse selection of what you extract. And then if you extract just a bit too much, you're also going to include some bad stuff.
Hmm.
So the better the grinder is, the better you're going to be able to really select which level of extraction you want to achieve without going over to the bad
Yep.
compounds.
Yep. Okay. Um, something that you know much more about than I do for sure is someone asked about best practices for freezing beans for brewing.
Mm.
I know you probably have like an entire chest freezer for your coffee samples now. Um, you do an amazing amount of freezing. Um, but let's walk through. You get a bag of coffee, and
Yeah.
you want to be as careful as you can with the bag, and you want to freeze it under certain conditions, vacuum sealed, etc. Like tell me your process.
So this is what my freezer looks
Oh
like.
my
So
gosh!
it's
Wow.
full of coffee, basically.
I guess I
So
guess.
maybe I'm not the best example because it's a bit extreme, but what I would first recommend is to, if you're gonna drink a bag of coffee within a couple of weeks, just leave it in the bag. If you have a good roaster bag that has like a Ziploc mechanism, like this one here, you can leave it there for, I don't know, maybe after you open the bag a couple of weeks. If you're going to drink it all within a couple of weeks, you're fine. And I wouldn't go like to the extremes of freezing everything if you are going to drink it early. But
Yep.
if you want to accumulate a lot of different coffees or keep them for later, there's a couple different strategies. So if you are going to go for the longest preservation time, I would recommend single dosing the coffee and vac sealing it. So with a food saver, a small machine, you can vac seal individual doses and put them in the freezer. This is the most extreme like that you're gonna get, because you can preserve coffee for like a year or more by doing
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
but it's wasteful. It's long, it's expensive, and it's wasteful.
Yeah.
So I do a mix of different strategies. I do this for maybe 1 or 2 doses per bag of coffee,
Hmm.
just to preserve some for the long term. And the rest, I split them in single dosed containers and put them in the freezer. They're like the Weber plastic cellar thing. Yeah, I put them in the door of my freezer. And the coffee that I'm going to drink soon, I just keep it in the roaster bag, as long as the roaster bag is of a good quality. And I keep a couple of them for any time I get coffee in a paper bag without a valve, without a Ziploc mechanism. And then I transfer it to a good coffee bag for consumption. So one thing you can also do if you want to preserve a whole bag of coffee for the long term, you can tape the one-way valve and put it in the freezer, as long as it's a good, a well-sealed bag. I
Yeah.
wouldn't do that once the bag was open, though.
Yeah.
And another thing I would add is that most roaster bags are surprisingly good at keeping coffee fresh before you opened it the first time. So I've did some blind tasting experiments where I wasn't able to distinguish a 3 months old bag that was never opened from
Yeah.
a fresh bag.
Yeah. I have to say that, I hope I can say this the right way. Anything that seems objectively true in coffee gets beaten to death and then eventually gets taken maybe too far. So, 20, 30 years ago, the only thing anybody could agree on was, fresher is better, fresher is better, fresher is better. And
Mhm.
it was like beaten to death, right? And the thing that got lost in that messaging was that, you know what, if it's a relatively light roast and it doesn't have oil on the outside, the coffee is going to taste really good 3 or 4 weeks after roasting. It's really not going to deteriorate much. If there's oil on the outside, I think the oil turns rancid, and some of us are sensitive to that. But if you have a good light roast, you don't have to freeze. You don't have to drink it within 2 or 3 days of roasting. All these extreme things like coffee tastes pretty good for several weeks. And to your point, I think freezing is just really good for very long term storage. But people don't have to go nuts with freezing things that they're going to be drinking over 2 or 3 weeks after roasting.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so okay, awesome, good practice for freezing. This was a pretty good question that it's been on my mind recently. Someone says, is it worth adjusting the filter paper as a brewing variable? Um, I would say I'll throw in my 2 cents in, and I know you have a lot more to say about it than I do. Um, when I first started using the Sybarist filters, I
Mhm.
found that although I didn't like some things about it, like the coffee came out a little murkier, there was
Yeah.
more body, but there was less clarity. But what I really liked about it was that I had a few troublesome coffees, like some decaf and some Ethiopia, that the only way to avoid choking with those coffees was to grind a lot coarser than I wanted to, and I felt like the coffee was getting too weak. Um, and the Sybaris filters made it really easy to brew some of those coffees without worrying about choking. So I
Right.
felt like they had a purpose.
Mhm.
Although, generally I like coffee to be cleaner. But you did some wonderful experimentation, which you wrote about in your book and I believe on your blog about different filter papers
Yeah.
and porosity and whatnot. So tell me a little bit about what you learned about filters and how you would make use of that in a practical setting.
Yeah. So different filters on the market have different properties, and it's mostly related to the pores
Hmm.
inside on the filter. But there's also the thickness of the filter that's an important factor. So the thicker a filter is, the slower your brew is going to be. But it doesn't mean your brew is going to clog more. To the contrary, the filter is going to be able to accept more fines before it clogs if it's much thicker.
So you
So
said
there's,
thicker filters will be slower.
yes,
Okay, is that always the case? Because I feel like I've had some exceptions where I've had some pretty thick filters that brewed reasonably fast.
that's true, but that's because it's only one part of
Yeah.
the
Okay.
explanation. So
Sure.
if you keep everything the same and make the filter thicker, it's going to be slower. But you can also make the pores larger,
Mm-hmm.
or you can have more pores per
Sure.
unit surface. So those are all important variables. So ideally, what I would want from a filter is to be very thick, to
Mm-hmm.
have uniform pores, and to have the pores be large enough that you get a good flow, but
Mm-hmm.
not so large that you have a lot of fines that can pass through. Like the
Sure.
Sybarist, for example, is an
Yeah.
example that is going to let through a lot of fines, which is okay if you like body, but as you do, I prefer a little bit cleaner coffee.
Sure.
Um, so one of the things that I like about thicker filters is that it's harder to clog them. So they're always going to be a bit slower, but they're also going to require more fines before they clog.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a balance between two different things. And in my experience, I really like the Hario filters without the small tab on the side. They're very thick and they have quite uniform pores.
Hmm.
But if you take the more recent ones with a little tab, they're thinner and they have a little bit less pores. So that's going to affect clogging. So they're easier to clog if you have a lot of fines in your coffee.
Hmm.
And another factor that I find interesting is I don't know if you have noticed some filters are creped, so they're like how would you say they're like I'm lacking the words,
They have
like
like
they
a
have
rougher surface, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
So that's good in my opinion,
Yeah.
especially where the coffee touches the filter, because it's like a way to improve the surface of the filter. And more surface means more flow. It
Hmm.
means more capacity to absorb fines before it clogs.
Yeah.
So crept filters, I tend to prefer them also.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Mm.
Um, okay. Cool.
Oh, I
Yeah.
realized I didn't actually answer the question, which is changing filter
Hmm.
as a brew variable. So I would generally avoid to constantly change the filter, with the exception that you mentioned. If you have a very cloggy coffee, maybe use a Siberist filter. That's a good strategy. But in other scenarios, I wouldn't always change a filter when changing coffee. I would instead try to find a filter that almost never clogs for you, and then I would stick to this filter. So lately, I've been changing filters a little bit because I'm using the Stag dripper and I've been combining it with the V60 filter or
Hmm.
Stag filters. And I'm just not satisfied yet with how I can achieve filter placement in the
Yeah.
Stag with the V60 filters. And that's the only reason why I've been going back and forth between them and the Stag filters.
Yeah.
But generally, I would stick with the same filter.
Yeah. Someone asked a question here about whether the amount of water you use to pre-wet the filter will change the porosity of the filter paper. I mean, I guess would the temperature or amount of water used have any impact on porosity once the filter is wet?
So asking about porosity when the filter is dry doesn't make much sense to me,
Yeah.
but I suspect the pores do probably expand a little when you add water. However, I don't think this depends a lot on the quantity of water you add. I suspect that after you add just a couple grams, they're going to have expanded as much as they will.
The pores expand or the fibers expand?
You're right. It's the fibers that are going to expand. So the effect on the pores are probably going to be to reduce them a
Yeah,
little bit.
I think
So
so. Yeah.
the pores, imagine you have a big pile of tree branches. The pores are just the spacings between the branches. So in the case of a paper filter, it's really just some fibers that are thrown randomly and you have spacings between them. So if the fibers expand a little bit, then the pores are going to be slightly smaller.
Sure.
And one thing that I tried to do was to quantify that with a microscope, but I have just a really cheap microscope, and as soon as you add the tiniest amount of water to the filter, it becomes completely translucent, and you just can't see the pores anymore under the microscope. So
Right.
I wasn't able to characterize that, but just based on logic, I would say that hot water is probably going to make the fibers expand a little faster, but even cold water is probably going to achieve the same thing in just a couple seconds more. And then it's not gonna change much, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. Several people, for some reason, ever since we started talking about the number of pours that you're doing, suddenly several people are referencing this 4 to 6, 4 to 4, colon 6, the 4-6 ratio
Hmm.
brewing method.
Yeah.
I don't think that's what you're talking about, and I don't think either one of us is really practicing that. I'm not sure why people suddenly think that that's what we're referring to.
Maybe the recipe is a bit similar. I think it does 4 to 6 pours. I'm not sure about the details.
Yeah,
This is a recipe that a champion barista used for a competition. I forget what his name is,
yeah,
but what I don't like about this method is not necessarily if you like it, that's fine. But what I
sure.
don't like was the explanations that came with it, like the first couple pours control sweetness, the other ones
Yeah,
control
yeah,
acidity. I'm very skeptical of these
yeah,
claims. I don't think they're based on much data.
yeah.
So it's basically I just I just think what I just said about pours earlier, if you do more pours, it's gonna be maybe a bit harder to achieve a good brew. You're gonna need a good grinder, maybe a flat bottom is gonna help, and very well insulating
Hmm.
dripper is going to
Hmm.
help too. But
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong otherwise
Yeah,
with
actually,
that.
Dennis says here, the grind is really coarse in the 4 to 6 brew, and his name is Tetsu Kasuya. So,
Yes,
right,
that
right.
yeah,
So,
exactly. He has his
yeah.
own dripper also, so he made the grinds coarser and removed some of the ridges at the bottom of the V60 to slow down the flow.
Hmm.
So that's, I mean, that's a way to do it. If you have a longer brew time and coarser particles, I think you're going to change the taste profile a little,
Yeah,
and but you might achieve similar extractions because you have a longer brew time.
yeah, yeah. Um, People have asked a lot of questions about seasoning burrs at home.
Right.
I know. For me, I've virtually begged Baratza and Niche and several other companies to do something about seasoning home grinders because, you might need 6 7 kilos to season
Hmm.
most grinder burrs,
Right.
and no one at home who buys coffee at retail is going to want to both take the time
Mm.
and the expense to do it. I mean, the beans you buy for your seasoning might cost as much as your grinder in some cases.
Right.
I don't know. Is there? Have you ever tried? I know it's controversial, but ever tried the raw rice
No, I
method?
haven't.
Um,
No,
I, I
I
I
haven't
tried
dared.
it. I
Yeah.
tried it, and it definitely seasoned the burrs, but I felt very insecure about how far to take it because I'd read that it
Mm.
can also kind of ruin the burrs pretty quickly.
Ooh.
So I don't know what the truth is about that, but it definitely achieved seasoning. I might have gone too far pretty quickly,
It
you know.
might void your warranty too, depending on manufacturer. So that's a good
Yeah,
thing to pay
yeah,
attention to. I
yeah.
remember, I think it was the Baratza Forte in the manual. It said that if you put anything other than roasted coffee, it's good that they mentioned roasted. It
Right,
might
right.
void the warranty. So,
Yeah, yeah,
um, otherwise, I would try and go to your local roasters and try to ask them for bad batches, maybe. So
yeah,
that's a good way where you could get a lot of coffee for a lower price.
yeah.
I have read some mentions that carbon monoxide might get high if you grind a lot of coffee in an enclosed space.
Yes,
So I
yes.
would maybe do that outside on the balcony or something like that. Just if you're going to grind like 7 kilos within half an hour, just to be safe. It might
Hmm.
not be high enough to be a problem, but I wouldn't really try it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, and Dennis made the point. He's right. It's actually parboiled rice that I use, not raw rice, because
Oh,
parboiled
okay.
rice is like kind of hard, but
Hmm.
softer than raw rice. Um, maybe you'll understand what this person means. I don't. Mirror Coffee Roasters asks, any thoughts on separating the bloom and then adding it to the brew later to taste? So I think he's talking about setting aside the Bloom's coffee liquid and then just
Yeah.
adding some of it, but not all of it, to the brew later.
Yeah, I think that's what I mean. I haven't tried it. It might be interesting just for curiosity. I would tend to think that the first the first drips from the bloom are going to contain the least amount of the chemicals you usually want to get rid of.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I would be surprised if you achieved something better by removing some of the bloom. But it might be interesting to taste them separately.
Hmm.
It seems like from some of the papers I've seen, like Elero and Navarini,
Hmm.
2019, I think they modeled some of the extraction rates of different chemicals, and they seemed to show that caffeine extracts really fast.
Yeah.
So it might be a way to get less caffeine. I'm not sure. One would need to measure that, and that's very hard. But otherwise, I'm not sure what the use of that would be other than learning
Yeah.
about how the taste changes. Yeah.
Yeah. Someone made a comment here. All these techniques used in the Brewers Championship start to make sense when you have to make 3 brews at the same time with very expensive coffees. I don't doubt that. My
Mm.
only complaint, and I think Jonathan agrees with me here, is that you hear a lot of pseudoscientific explanations during brewing competitions about why people do what they do and why it affects the coffee flavor the way it does, and a lot of it seems like kind of nonsense. Um, so it's not that they did a bad job brewing the coffee. It's just that the explanations are not always accurate.
Right. There's a strong incentive to being
Yes.
original. So
Yes.
that's a problem
Yeah, it is.
because
It is.
you can't always be original like every day, every year, and constantly bring something groundbreaking. So that pushes people to try some really crazy stuff. I think this is good. So maybe someone's gonna discover some really interesting things that way. But
Right.
I wouldn't regard any of the explanations or the techniques as something that's secure, something that you
Yeah.
can take at face value. It's like
Exactly.
experimentation. It's
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Someone asked the question: is there a simple explanation for why hotter water creates faster flow? I believe it just has to do with the viscosity of water.
Yeah.
Is there
So
anything else to it than that?
I don't think there's more to it than that. So any liquid gets more viscous as you make it hotter. So water, less viscous, sorry, as you make it hotter. So water is no exception. And as liquids get less viscous, they are better at flowing through small pores.
Hmm.
So they feel less resistance from the same coffee bed. So if you use much hotter water, you're gonna have a slightly faster flow. If I recall well, it was of the order of 20% faster between 90 degrees and 100 degrees, something like that. Don't quote me on that, but
Hmm.
I have a post on my Instagram on my profile like maybe a couple months ago where I used tables of water viscosity and Darcy's law to make a prediction on about how much faster it was going to be. So yeah.
Yes. Something I'd love you to talk about that no one's mentioned here, but in your book you talk about the D10, like the 10% finest particles in
Hmm.
the grind particle distribution, and how that's kind of the driver of flow rate through the coffee bed with a certain water, etc.
Hmm.
Can you try to explain that? I don't want to try to explain it.
Yeah. So there's been some research done by scientists who study the percolation of water in soil about how fast it is going to flow compared to the grind size, well, not the grind size, but the size of the sand particles.
Hmm.
And basically, what is most important is the smallest particles. Those are the ones who are going to affect flow a lot more. If you add a lot of large particles, you're also going to affect the flow and make it a little bit faster. But finer particles are going to have a much larger impact on flow.
Hmm.
So if you are going to measure an average size or something like that, it's not going to track very well how much the flow is going to change. What is going to track much better with it is looking at the 10% smallest particles. So if you were going to sieve all of your coffee particles and weigh every stage of the sifting set, you would weigh the smallest one and then the next smallest one. And as soon as you hit 10% of the dose you sifted, that's the value you want to use, and that's going to track with the flow of water. So let's say, for example, that you have a grinder that generates a very similar particle size distribution. Well, let's say you have two grinders with very similar particle size distributions, except that one has more fines. Um, the second one with more fines is going to flow much slower because the value for D10, the moment when you count your sifting stages, the moment when you hit 10% is going to happen at much finer values. And that's going to tell you that the water is going to flow more slowly. So it's not just the average of the grind size that tells you how fast the water flows. It's the D10 value, so the value at 10% of the total mass.
Okay. Cool. Someone referred back to freezing, and
Yeah.
so he's curious if you think frozen beans will grind more uniformly, or less, I suppose. I'll say that I used to be worried about taking frozen beans, putting them in the grinder, and having some condensation form, and whether that would affect the flavor. But you've had pretty ample experience with freezing, and tell me what you've learned about freezing and grind quality, and whether you feel like there's any effect on the flavor.
So I tried to actually measure grind quality and how it changes with temperature. And it turns out it's very hard with the app I wrote. So if you don't know, I wrote a small app where you take a photo of the grinds and you analyze them and you get a particle size distribution from it. And if you do that with a normal camera, you're not going to see the smallest fines. And
Hmm.
that's a good subject to talk about now because we just said that the smallest fines are what's going to affect flow the most.
Hmm.
So I don't see big changes in the particles that I can see from an iPhone photo by changing the temperature. There's no big swing, but there seems to be some changes in the amount of fines. So if you're going to microwave coffee, it flows a little bit faster, and that's probably because there's less fines. However, if you microwave coffee, it also tastes much worse in my experience. In all cases I've tried, it probably helps the aromas to degas faster and you get
Yeah.
less of them. And I think that the contrary might happen with frozen coffee. Maybe the delay between when you grind and when you brew, there's going to be a bit less aromas that are lost from that, but you
Hmm.
might get a little bit more fines. All I can say is with my grinder, I don't see big problems arising from grinding frozen coffee for filter coffee. It might be different for espresso, but for filter coffee, I don't get much different brew times. I can't say for sure that it tastes better, but there's no big difference for sure when I
Yeah.
grind frozen versus room temperature. However, with grinders that generate more fines, it's possible that it has a much bigger impact. So
Hmm.
all I can speak to is my own experience with that. Yeah.
Yep. Someone asked an interesting question here. I've always thought about this. If you're using a hand grinder and
Mm,
you don't turn it smoothly, let's say you stop or you pause,
mm,
or sometimes they get a little stuck and you have to kind of
yeah.
fight to start it again. Can you speculate on how that might affect the grind quality?
I think in most cases, it probably makes it a little bit wider.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I see with my own Burs, I see a quite a significant impact if I grind at different RPM. So if
Hmm.
you're always going to change RPM, it's like you change grind size a little as you grind. So you're going to get a wider distribution. The only exception I could see to that is if you have some weird geometry of the burrs that would make the grind size independent of rotation rate.
Right.
And I think that could possibly be achievable,
Hmm.
but in most burrs probably won't have that. So in general, if you grind at very different RPMs, you might get different, slightly wider particle size
Yeah.
distributions. It's not like a crazy difference of grind size, but it's a couple percent, maybe 10, 20% if you grind twice as fast, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. And I should say, most hand grinders are conical burr grinders that do a much better job of grinding at very low RPMs than
Hmm.
flat burrs do. Yeah.
Yeah, the hand grinders are designed around grinding manually, so they're probably also better with RPM variations. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I have a good question for you that I've been meaning to ask you for the last couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
When I make manual brew with my niche grinder versus my Barazza Forte, I might get very, very similar brew times and very similar extraction levels, but the coffee bed after it's done, the coffee bed from the niche looks a lot muddier. And I don't know if it has something to do. It's certainly not due to an exceptionally different amount of fines, because if there was really a different amount of fines, the brew times wouldn't be so close with the same extraction level,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I
So I'm wondering, particle shape, like what factors might be leading to these muddy coffee beds from the niche?
I have a hypothesis. I would be surprised if it's particle shape. It could
Hmm.
be, but I would be surprised if that had a big impact. My biggest hypothesis would be coffee chaff. So flat
Okay.
burrs
Yeah.
tend to preserve it very well. You get big chunks of chaff coming out. However, that depends on the geometry. Some of the geometries are more efficient at actually grinding the chaff.
Yeah.
And I suspect that the niche might grind more of the chaff. And the chaff is like the silver skin on the
Yes.
surface of the coffee beans. So has a very low density. And as you pour water and agitate the brew, it's going to tend to lift to the surface. And that's often what makes it look like it's more muddy. It's just chaff that's well mixed and that has expanded from being wet.
Hmm.
And I think that if you grind it finer, if you grind the chaff finer, it's going to create more of a paste. and it's going to
Yeah.
look a bit muddier. So
Yep.
that I haven't seen your bed, so I'm not sure, but I would hypothesize that might be the explanation.
I think you're onto something because with some of my grinders, it's pretty easy to see little bits of chaff after
Hmm.
while I'm brewing and such. But with the niche, I don't really. The chaff seems
Right.
to be integrated better, so you're definitely
Yeah.
onto something there. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed with mine big chunks of chaff flying
Hmm.
out everywhere. Yeah. Mm.
So someone who's a follower of yours here says, in your Patreon, you had mentioned brewing with stronger brew ratios and finer grind setting, and then diluting after the fact. Can you touch on this approach to brewing and diluting?
Yeah, we had been discussing that yesterday, actually.
Hmm.
So I have this suspicion that maybe it's possible to achieve slightly higher extraction yields with good tasting brews if you grind a bit finer and lower the amount of water that you pour on the coffee.
Hmm.
If you grind finer, you're gonna need less water to extract all the good stuff from the
Hmm.
beans.
Hmm.
So you might need to stop with less water, but then you're going to end up with a stronger brew. So you might dilute it afterwards.
Hmm.
However, there's several complications to that. If you grind finer, it's harder to avoid channels. It's harder to achieve an even flow through the coffee bed.
Hmm.
And it's harder to avoid bypass of water around the coffee bed
Hmm.
because as the coffee has more resistance,
Right.
that's what I was telling Scott yesterday. The more resistant your coffee bed is, the more water is going to try to flow somewhere else. So
Hmm.
if you can really prevent water from flowing anywhere else, then I think you might open up the possibility of grinding a bit finer using a smaller ratio and then obtaining a good extraction but a stronger brew. This is what we actually do with espresso
Yeah.
taken to the extreme.
Yeah.
But as you know, for espresso, it's much harder to get an even flow. And also, with espresso, you need to assist the brew with a pump with high pressure, and that's going to have another effect. It's going to send a lot of coffee fines through your brew. Even if you added a paper filter, any pressure is going to help the fines travel through the filter pores, and you're going to end up with more body. That's why
Hmm.
the allongés have more body anyway.
Hmm.
And I wanted to mention also, if you grind finer, there's yet another issue that can arise. It's filter clogging if
Yeah.
you don't use a pump. So if
Yeah.
you can avoid filter clogging and still get a good even flow through the bed, my prediction would be that you can grind a bit finer, use a lower ratio, and achieve a good extraction, maybe a slightly even higher extraction, but it's going to be much harder to do
Yeah.
it properly.
Yeah. I think, the general rule to me is that if you can achieve a similar extraction with a coarser grind, that it's
Hmm.
always safe. It's always safer to do that
Hmm.
because you run less risk of filter clogging, you run less
Yeah.
risk of choke points in a brew.
Hmm.
You run less risk of forming those channels around the choke points, and it's like it's messy to try to go finer and force that to be successful. Like you might succeed
Yeah.
sometimes, but it's just not going to be as high frequency of a success.
Hmm.
Um, and interestingly, I mean, I know this is a different topic, but to me, the Allongé tastes wildly better than an Americano of the same strength made from a
Hmm.
short shot with water added.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm sure there's multiple reasons why that might be the case, but I suspect that the slightly coarser grind of the Allongé really helps decrease the amount of clogging and choking that might be contributing to some unpleasant flavors.
Yeah, it reminds me of that recent paper from forget
Oh, right, from
Cameron.
Hendon and stuff. Yeah,
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 yeah.
Cameron and Hendon. So it's about that basically. If you have a faster flow by grinding coarser, it's easier to achieve an even flow through the pot.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
there's some actual papers with simulations of the physics of what happens when you have a denser and finer porous medium. And basically, whatever you do, the finer you grind, the less even flow is going to be. But even on top of that, it's going to be harder to avoid channels. But even in the absence of channels, if you have like, imagine you have a variation in pore size, but all the pores are smaller. The small pores are going to offer so much more resistance in a scenario where all the pores are smaller that water is going to flow almost always through the largest pores. So if you make all the pores a bit larger, the flow is going to be more evenly distributed across all the paths it can take. So the finer the pores are, the less even the flow is going to be inherently, regardless of whatever else you do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry, I'm just reading through all these comments here. There's
Yeah,
been a ton. I'm really sorry
but
to a lot of people who have asked
yeah, there's
questions
so
that we
many.
haven't covered because I'm trying to stick to certain themes and things that, Jonathan, referenced in his book and things like that. And we can't get to
Maybe
every comment.
maybe we can
Yep.
answer Thibault's comments. He asked this a while ago. So there's this new paper that came out about brew temperature, who said that
Oh, right, right.
changing the slurry temperature has no effect on taste based on their collection of people who tasted coffee and rated it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I take it with skepticism. I can say one thing for sure, that one of the biggest impacts of temperature is going to be how fast stuff extracts from the coffee. So what they said in the paper was not that temperature has no impact. It was that temperature impacts extraction, but at the same extraction, different temperatures had no impact. That's what they found.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think this is true with most specialty coffee and how we brew it in specialty. I suspect that if you take dark brews, dark roasted coffee, and remain at slightly low extraction yields, it might be the case that it all tastes pretty much like coffee. But I'm kind of how would you say, I'm skeptical about the fact that this would be true with specialty coffee, and it really does not match my own experience. So I keep very detailed logs of my brews, and I have some examples of brews for which I achieved the same extraction yield, but different temperatures, and the taste was subjectively not just a bit different. I'm very confident I could distinguish them from blind tasting, because the best case scenario for this test, in my opinion, is using a coffee that's a bit darker, but just slightly darker than average specialty. And in my experience, there's like a threshold. If you go above a given temperature, it becomes very bitter.
Mm-hmm.
And I have ridden this limit, this threshold, just below the temperature that makes it taste bitter or not. And I can compensate with grind size and go just above or just below the temperature that makes it taste bitter.
Mm-hmm.
And I can achieve the same extraction, but one brew tastes really much bitter than the other. And this bitterness I find easy to distinguish. So that's why I'm
Yep.
confident I could tell the difference with a blind tasting.
Yep. Okay.
Mm.
We are within 1 minute of losing our connection because it limits us to 1 hour.
Oh,
So I'm going to sign off here. I'm going to mention again that Jonathan has a new book coming out early 2021 called The Physics of Filter Coffee, and I hope everybody reads it. And Jonathan has a blog called Coffee Ad Astra, coffeeadastra.com. So you can hear more of his research and thoughts on filter brewing. You're awesome. Thank you so much for the conversation. I've learned a lot, as I always do when I talk to you.
yeah, thanks.
Yeah, let's do something like this again when we're closer to your book launch. All right.
Yeah, sure. This is fun.
Okay,
Thanks a lot.
awesome. All right. Thanks everybody for joining and thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And this will be saved on my Instagram. Okay. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.